You think betrayal stings? Try being the family wallet in disguise. I gave them 10 years of my life, sleepless nights, student debts, silence, and the moment I ended up in a hospital bed, bruised, broken, barely breathing, they were popping champagne in Hawaii for my sister's baby shower, paid with my money, no one visited, no one called. And that's when something inside me snapped, not with a scream, but with clarity. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about reclaiming everything they tried to take. Dignity, power, and the right to finally choose myself. Let me tell you how it all began. Claire Emerson stepped out of the conference room with a deep breath and a folder thick enough to suffocate. The late afternoon sun slanted through the 32nd floor windows of Chicago Financial Group, but inside her private office, the air was cool and clinical. Her heels clicked softly against the tile as she moved with practiced grace, like someone who'd long mastered the art of containing exhaustion. A soft knock broke the silence. Danielle Park peeked in, coffee in hand. "Brunch this Sunday? Just us girls. You need something that isn't a spreadsheet." Claire offered a faint smile. "Can't. Heading to Evanston to see my parents." Danielle tilted her head. "Ah, family time. Will Sophie be there?" Claire hesitated. "Of course. She's..." glowing. "Newly married. Lucas runs his own real estate firm, and now she's pregnant." Her voice dimmed. "Everyone's obsessed with the baby already." Danielle nodded gently, but didn't press. She knew better than to ask too much about Claire's family. After Danielle left, Claire sat at her desk and opened her banking app. The numbers stared back like ghosts. $5,000 transfers each month for a decade, totaling over $600,000, all toward repaying her Harvard tuition, a loan from her parents. When you can, they'd said, pay it back when you're able. And she had, without fail. She reached for a drawer and pulled out the original contract, a scanned PDF, still bearing the faint watermark of her father's stationery. No fixed deadline, no interest, but plenty of expectations. She leaned back, and for a brief second, her mind wandered. A younger Claire, no more than 9, held up a test paper with a bold red A+ scrawled across the top. Her heart swelled, only to be pierced moments later. Her father barely glanced up. "Sophie drew a picture of a unicorn today," he'd said. "It's stunning." Her mother chimed in. Claire's paper drooped in her hand. That was the first time she realized being excellent wouldn't be enough. Not when your sister was extraordinary. Back in her office, she closed the banking app, the drawer, and the thought. But a quiet ache pulsed under her ribcage, a weight that came from chasing approval in a house that only ever offered comparisons. She didn't know it yet, but something was already cracking. Rain streaked across the taxi windows like tired fingers dragging down glass. Claire sat in the back seat, phone in hand, swiping through reports, emails, calendars, her life's rhythm. A ping sounded, another reminder, client call, 9 a.m. Monday. She sighed, leaned her head back for just a moment. Headlights, screeching tires, a deafening crunch, shattered glass like 1,000 knives, everything went black. When she opened her eyes, fluorescent lights glared above. Her body ached in places she couldn't name. Her right arm was in a cast, her left leg elevated. A dull throb pulsed through her ribs. The doctor's voice was calm but distant. "You're lucky. Broken arm, fractured femur, rib bruising, some internal bleeding. You'll need at least 6 weeks of rest." Claire blinked slowly, her voice barely made it out. "Is anyone here?" The nurse glanced at the chart. "Just to Christine Lynn. She's been calling to check in." Later that day, Christine showed up with flowers and a bag of her favorite snacks. "I had to fight the nurse to get in here," she joked gently. Claire smiled weakly, touched but overwhelmed. No messages from her parents, no calls, no texts. Day 1 passed. Then 2. Alone in her hospital bed, Claire finally picked up her phone and called her mother. Maggie answered on the 3rd ring. "Claire, can this wait?" "I'm in the hospital," Claire said, voice shaking. "There was a car accident. I'm okay, but..." Oh, Claire, Maggie interrupted, exasperated. Honestly, now, Brittany just had the baby. We're in Hawaii. It's been chaos. Claire's chest tightened. I just thought maybe you'd want to know. You always make everything about you. Don't ruin this for Sophie. The line went dead. Numb, Claire opened Facebook. The first photo she saw, her parents, in floral leis, clinking champagne glasses beside a pool. Fairmont Orchid, Big Island, Hawaii. Her sister, Sophie, glowing in a designer maternity gown, caption from Maggie. The best gift for us, Sophie, with love and Megan's contribution. Claire stared at the screen. Then something inside her hardened, not shattered, not broken, just steeled. The sterile beep of the hospital monitor was the only sound in the room as Claire stared at the ceiling, replaying the last 48 hours like a warped slideshow. Every memory was sharper now, cut deeper. That caption, that party, that betrayal. She opened her phone again, but this time, not to beg. She called Nate Carter. He arrived the next afternoon, stepping into her room in a crisp navy suit. His face softened the moment he saw her condition. Claire, he breathed. I'm fine, she said flatly, or I will be. I need legal advice. She handed him her iPad, screen already loaded with the PDF of the loan contract. Nate pulled up a chair and scrolled. No interest, no timeline. Technically, you're not obligated to continue payments, especially not if funds are being misused without your consent. Claire's eyes didn't leave his. So I can stop? He nodded. And if they try to sue, we'll counter, trust me. She exhaled. Nate hesitated. Claire, there's something else. I looked into the Caldwell estate. Your grandparents' assets. The will includes a clause. Inheritance shall go to the grandchild who safeguards the family's well-being. He met her gaze. Your parents used that estate as collateral. Claire closed her eyes, letting the fury wash over her, controlled now, focused. They used my money, they stole from my future, and they never even showed up. Her voice was low but crisp as glass. I'm done being the reliable one. I'm done being the wallet. Nate slid a folder across her lap. If you're ready, we begin proceedings immediately. Stop payments, file for inheritance control. This is how we fight back. Claire took the pen. For 10 years she'd played the role, obedient, quiet, the responsible daughter. She signed the documents. And for the first time in a long time, Claire Emerson didn't feel broken. She felt powerful. Claire was sitting upright in her hospital bed when she heard the sharp clip of heels in the hallway. The door swung open. Maggie Emerson, pristine as ever in a cream cardigan and pearls, entered first, lips tight with irritation. Robert followed, his jaw clenched, eyes scanning the room like a disappointed CEO arriving late to a failed meeting. You stopped the transfers, Maggie said without preamble. Claire, Sophie needs that money. They're closing on a new house. Claire blinked, steady. You're here because of money, not because your daughter almost died. Maggie scoffed. Don't be dramatic. You broke a leg, not your spine. And we had that trip planned for months. Claire reached to her bedside table and tapped her phone. She pulled up the Facebook post and turned the screen toward them. You call me dramatic, but you had time to fly to Hawaii and toast champagne at Sophie's baby shower, paid for with my loan repayments. Her voice was flat, but her hands were shaking. Robert stepped forward, his tone defensive but laced with panic. We've been under pressure. The wedding, the North Shore condo, the shower. It all cost more than we expected. Your payments helped stabilize things. Stabilize things, Claire repeated, voice rising just slightly. You mean you've been funneling my money into Sophie's life, pretending it came from you? There was a beat of silence. Maggie wouldn't meet her daughter's eyes. Robert's face turned red. You didn't even ask, Claire said quietly. And now you show up, not to apologize, but to demand more? Robert slammed his palm onto the tray table. You think this is how family treats each other? Cutting us off? Claire turned away from them, staring at the white wall ahead. Her voice was calm. The court will speak for me now. Maggie opened her mouth, but no words came out. Robert muttered something under his breath. The door shut behind them with a final echoing click. And Claire didn't flinch. It was nearly dusk when the knock came at the Bayview cottage door. Claire, now recovering at home, opened it to find Sophie on the porch, no designer bag, no styled waves, just a pale face and puffy eyes. "I needed to see you," Sophie whispered. Claire let her in without a word. They sat in silence until Sophie finally said, "Ryan and I, we're in debt, serious debt. His firm's collapsing. We've been living off loans and favors." Claire stared. Sophie looked down, twisting her fingers. "All the money Mum and Dad gave us, it wasn't theirs, it was part of a trust, named after me but funded by you and by the estate." Claire's expression didn't change. "I saw the paperwork," Sophie added. "Ryan found it." At that moment, Ryan stepped through the door, holding a manila folder. "I'm sorry, Claire," he said, voice steady. "We didn't know. But once I found this," he placed the folder on the table, "I told Sophie we couldn't stay tied to any of it. We're leaving the Emerson circle. We're done." Claire opened the folder. It was the formal documentation of the Sophie Legacy Trust. Source of funds, Megan Emerson's, repayments, and Caldwell estate collateral. Sophie's eyes welled again. "I used to envy how smart you were, but now I envy that you know who you are, that you're not pretending." Claire swallowed the knot rising in her throat. "I'm not angry," she said. "But I can't forget the silence. You knew I was in the hospital. You didn't call." Sophie nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I was ashamed." Claire reached out, hesitated, then wrapped an arm around her sister, slightly, not tight. A beginning, not a reconciliation. A step forward, but not yet forgiveness. The heavy oak doors of Evanston Estate creaked open under Claire's hand. She stepped into the grand sitting room with Nate at her side, legal folder in hand. Harold and Evelyn Caldwell, her grandparents, looked up from their armchairs. Claire took a breath. "There's something you need to know." She laid it all out, how Robert used her repayments, how the estate had been collateralized without their knowledge, how she'd been discarded again and again. Harold's hand trembled around his cane. Evelyn's eyes filled. "My God," she whispered. "How long have you lived like this, sweetheart?" Nate slid over the folder. "Under the stipulations of your will, the heir who protects the family's well-being should retain control of the estate. We're petitioning to transfer that control to Claire." Harold didn't hesitate. "Where do I sign?" He scrawled his name, followed by Evelyn. Claire's throat tightened as Nate notarized the papers. That evening, legal notice was delivered to Robert and Maggie, stripping them of all control over the Caldwell assets. Maggie called immediately. "This doesn't have to get ugly," she said, voice strained. "Let's just work it out, as a family." Claire's voice was flat. "My attorney will respond to you. Goodbye, Mother." She hung up. Later that night, Claire stood outside the Evanston estate, looking up at the window where she'd once curled up reading fairy tales as a girl. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged, not because she'd earned it, but because someone had finally seen her worth. And that made all the difference. The headlines hit like a storm. Lucas Morris under investigation for fraud. Morris Realty collapses overnight. Within a week, their lavish life in the North Shore Heights condo crumbled. Sophie and Lucas packed up what was left of their carefully curated image and moved to a modest duplex in the outskirts of Naperville. Meanwhile, Claire finalized the purchase of her new place. A sunlit apartment in Lakeview with wide windows facing the water, shelves she could fill with books, and enough silence to hear herself think. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't meant to be. It was hers. News of the Emerson family dispute made its way to the press. Court records, estate freezes, rumors of betrayal. Society, once charmed by the Emersons' curated elegance, turned away. Clients disappeared, invitations dried up, and with the pressure mounting, Robert collapsed in his office. At Chicago General, he was admitted for a mild stroke. Maggie stood alone in the fluorescent hallway, stunned when the hospital asked for an emergency deposit. None of their accounts had enough to cover it. 2 days later, the bill was paid in full. The source was anonymous, but the message was clear. Tucked beneath the invoice was a handwritten note. I don't forgive you, but I refuse to become like you. Maggie sat down on the bench just outside the ICU, the paper trembling in her hands. For the first time in years, tears came, not from control or manipulation, but from shame. Chapter 8. Seeds of Something New. Light poured into Claire's Lakeview apartment as she brewed her morning coffee. The space smelled like cinnamon and fresh air. It was a far cry from North Shore's marble silence. This place hummed with something quieter, something alive. Sophie had given birth to a baby boy, Daniel. Ryan had walked away from his old firm and now spent his days in a hard hat, building houses with his own 2 hands. The salary was modest, but he came home every night content. Sophie, meanwhile, had enrolled in online classes to become a preschool teacher, finally doing something for herself. Claire visited their small home one afternoon, holding little Daniel in her arms. The baby looked up at her, blinked and smiled. That single moment cracked something open inside her. I've never felt peace like this before, Sophie said softly, watching them. Claire met her gaze. Me neither. That night they ate dinner together, just the 3 of them at a wobbly second-hand table. They talked about dreams, books, new recipes. No legacy, no comparison, no guilt. As 3 people, relearning what it meant to be a family. Chapter 9. Holiday of One's Own. The snow outside lay at the windowsills in quiet white. Claire's apartment was bathed in warm, golden light, candles flickering, a small tree glowing beside the fireplace. She wore an oversized sweater, apron tied loosely at the waist as she basted the roast chicken. For the first time in her life, Claire had invited family to her table. Sophie, Ryan, and little Daniel. The meal was simple. Herb-roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh-baked apple pie, no fuss. No guests trying to impress each other, no phone cameras snapping for social media, just laughter and honest conversation. As Ryan helped clear the dishes, he paused, looked around, and said, "This is the first time I've ever felt like I belong in a family." Sophie leaned in gently. "Do you think you'll ever write back to Mom?" Claire thought for a moment, then smiled. Not bitter, just honest. "No, I'm not angry anymore, but I also don't need them anymore." They sat back down, wine glasses in hand. Claire raised hers. "To choosing yourself." Sophie lifted hers, eyes shining. "And to those brave enough to live truthfully." The glasses clinked. In that moment, with the snow still falling beyond the glass, everything felt quiet and exactly right. The headlines came fast and unforgiving. Morris Realty faces fraud investigation. Lucas had been accused of mismanaging investor funds. Within weeks, his company collapsed. The condo at North Shore Heights was listed for sale before the month's end. Sophie and Lucas, once the golden couple of Evanston, packed what was left of their life into cardboard boxes and moved to a modest rental on the city's edge. No doorman, no marble lobby, just silence and consequences. Meanwhile, Claire closed on her new apartment in Lakeview. It wasn't lavish, but it had tall windows that welcomed morning light, bookshelves she could finally fill, and a view of the lake that made her feel like the city was breathing with her. It was hers, fully and honestly, paid for with the early inheritance her grandparents granted her. Trust earned, not demanded. At Emerson and Gray, Claire's return to work was quiet but powerful. Her office door bore her name, and her voice carried weight in board meetings now. She'd rebuilt herself in silence while the Emerson name unraveled under the public eye. News outlets dissected the family's legal turmoil, calling it a cautionary tale of favoritism, misused trust, and a daughter's reckoning. Then came the call. Robert had suffered a stroke. He was rushed to the hospital with high blood pressure and a collapsed artery. Maggie stood alone in the hallway, watching the monitors beep behind the glass. No savings left, no friends remaining to lean on. The front desk received an anonymous payment covering Robert's medical bills. A note was tucked into the envelope. "I don't forgive you, but I refuse to become you." Later, as Maggie unfolded the slip of paper with trembling hands, tears welled in her eyes. Not from grief, but from something far rarer in her world: shame. For the first time in decades, she felt small, and maybe, deep down, she knew she had earned it. The soft glow of morning spilled into Claire's apartment, casting light across her wooden floors. On her kitchen table sat a single vase with fresh lilies, beside a half-written letter and a cup of still-steaming tea. Life was quiet, but full. Sophie had given birth to a baby boy, Daniel. Ryan had shuttered his company and taken a job as a structural engineer at a construction firm. The pay was modest, the work honest. He came home with dust on his collar and stories about concrete foundations and steel beams. Stories he told with pride. Sophie enrolled in online classes to become a preschool teacher. "I've always loved working with kids," she said shyly, "but Mum said the salary was too low, so I never let myself try." She sat in a sunlit corner of a local community centre, scribbling lesson plans between Daniel's naps. Claire visited often. When Daniel laughed for the first time in her arms, her throat tightened. His little fingers wrapped around hers, and for a moment the ache in her chest loosened. She looked at Sophie, who smiled through tired eyes. "For the first time," Sophie whispered, "I feel at peace." Claire nodded. "Me too." That evening, the three of them shared dinner. No silver platters, no catered menus, just roasted vegetables, chicken stew, and laughter that didn't need to be curated for social media. They talked about simple things: work, books, future plans, and no one measured their worth in money or perfection. There was no need to compete, no pressure to perform, only space and healing. Snow dusted the edge of Claire's balcony as she lit the last candle on her small, pine-scented wreath. Inside, her apartment glowed warm with golden lights. The tree stood modestly in the corner, adorned with ornaments she'd collected over the years, non-expensive, but each full of meaning. Sophie arrived with Ryan and baby Daniel just as the roasted chicken came out of the oven. Claire had prepared everything herself: garlic mashed potatoes, glazed carrots, a homemade apple pie cooling on the windowsill. It was the first Christmas dinner she had ever hosted, the first one that felt truly hers. There were no formalities, no stiff conversations, no false performances. Just real people, sharing food, sharing space, sharing breath. Ryan raised a glass midway through the meal. "I think this is the first time I've ever felt like I belong to a real family." Sophie glanced at Claire, then asked gently, "Have you thought about writing back to Mum?" Claire hesitated, then smiled, softly but without bitterness. "No, I'm not angry anymore, but I also don't need them anymore." She lifted her glass. "To choosing your own peace." Sophie clinked her glass against Claire's. "And to those brave enough to live honestly." Daniel gurgled and reached for a spoon, making both women laugh. Outside, the snow kept falling quietly. Inside, warmth lingered in every corner of the room. For the first time in a long time, Claire didn't feel like she was surviving the holidays. She felt like she was home. Flashes from camera bulbs lit the press room like staccato lightning. Claire stood at the podium, the Caldwell Legacy Foundation banner hanging behind her in muted elegance. Her blazer was simple, her voice steady, her presence unmistakably commanding. This wasn't the same woman who once whispered apologies into the void of family silence. This was a woman who had claimed her name, not just inherited it. "I was entrusted with a legacy," she said into the microphone, her tone quiet but resolute. "But legacies aren't about property, they're about people, and pain, when given a voice, can become purpose." The Caldwell estate, once bound by lineage and manipulation, was now something else entirely. Claire had transformed it into a non-profit organization, the Caldwell Legacy Foundation, dedicated to helping women who had been betrayed, silenced, or abandoned by the very families meant to protect them. Counseling services, legal support, emergency housing. Dignity restored. News outlets praised her as the heiress who chose healing. Others dubbed her the woman who rose from the ashes of a family scandal. But Claire turned down every book deal, every movie pitch, every polished narrative offer. She left a single press statement behind. This isn't a story for profit, it's a truth that needed to be told. Because silence never saved anyone. The conference ended, applause filled the room, but Claire didn't linger. She exited through a side door, her heels clicking against marble until the sound faded into stillness. Back at her apartment, morning light spilled across the hardwood floors. Claire brewed her coffee, the rich aroma filling the quiet space. She walked barefoot to the balcony, pulled open the glass door, and stepped into the crisp air. The skyline of Chicago stretched before her, wrapped in the soft blush of dawn. She sipped slowly, watching the city come alive. In the hush of that moment, she thought about the girl she used to be, the one who begged to be seen, who bent herself into silence just to belong. She closed her eyes and whispered, not to anyone, but to herself. I used to believe love meant being accepted, but now I know. The greatest kind of love is choosing yourself. And with the rising sun at her back, Claire Emerson smiled, not for anyone else, but because the legacy finally belonged to her. Sometimes the hardest battles are the quiet ones, fought behind closed doors, beneath layers of silence, and within the weight of what we don't say. But healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it begins the moment we stop explaining ourselves and start honoring who we are. Family doesn't always mean safety. Love doesn't always mean loyalty. And choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's sacred. If this story stirred something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below, hit follow and subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart. Your voice matters here.